because our lecture this evening is a little later than usual, so I thought it would be good that we get going. Thank you so much for braving the darkness and the weather to join us this evening to think together about what has happened and what doesn't go away. My name is Dominique Ryle. I am the new director of the Worth Institute of Austrian and Central European Studies. It is my great honor to be invited. There are many ex-directors in this room, so I have to live up to their very inspiring examples. Before I start introduce our introducer, I just wanted to make two comments. Thank you so much. And it is about acknowledgement. It's about acknowledgement of the lands that we're on, the land of Treaty 6 of the First Nations and the Tea people. Acknowledgement for me means everything that I care about. It is about dealing with loss and love and pain and promise. And I hope together we can work to find a way forward. This is what this lecture series is about too. The Toby and Saul Reichert lecture series was conceived as a way to make sure that communities, future communities, current communities, find ways to acknowledge what happened, to not forget, and to think what it means in new ways, in deeper ways, in broader ways, and in ways for new generations that perhaps don't have the same access points as many of us who knew people who were directly affected. We've lost an enormously important member of our community this year, Jillian Horowitz, who was on the committee who helped choose our Saul and Toby lecture series. And I just want to take a moment. I did not get to meet her, but I've heard so many wonderful stories about her that I'm mourning a loss of someone I haven't met. So I just want to say that this lecture is also in honor of someone who's given so much to our community and to this lecture series in particular. Tonight we are going to be thinking about the Holocaust and the loss of so many opportunities of what life could have been with our guest speaker, Ari Yoskovich from Vanderbilt University. But I'm actually not going to be introducing him this evening. We have this other pleasure that we have one of our own, Nikki Lugosi Schmidt. Oh my God, I'm so nervous that the person that I probably know best here is the one whose name I'm just missing up. She's an associate professor in political science in the Faculty of Meiji. I asked Nikki if she would be willing to introduce Ari this evening because I was so struck about the ambition of what she does. She thinks big, she thinks comparatively. She thinks about indigeneity, people of place and people of culture who have across worlds encountered different systems of repression, different systems of violence, and have created their own systems in order to persevere. She's, just to give you a sense of the breadth of her work, besides very deep studies in Canada, also Hungary, Germany, and Iran. This is the kind of thinker that we at the University of Alberta should be so proud to have amongst us. This is why I asked her if she would do us the honor of introducing tonight's lecture. People of place and people of culture who have across worlds.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Just as a quick correction, it's Dr. Nikki Lugosi Schmidt, a mouthful I know. Good evening and welcome everyone. I have the great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ari Yoskovich, our speaker for the 2025 annual Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust Lecture. His talk is titled Roma and the Holocaust. Dr. Yoskovich is the Eugene Greener Jr. Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of Jewish Studies and History at Vanderbilt University. His scholarship spans across her themes of the Holocaust, and European, Romani, and Jewish and cultural history. As a quick correction, tonight, Dr. Yoskovich is about his most I know, Rain of Ash. Yoskovich astutely reminds us in the book that empathy without knowledge is fleeting. And tonight we will learn from this important talk, Druze, Roma, and the Holocaust. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Ari Yoskovich.
Thank you for the invitation, first of all. Thank you to the Birth Institute, Dominique, for setting all of this up. Thank you to Nikki for this wonderful introduction. It is indeed a talk about marginalized histories. It is a talk I will give about how we reckon with dark histories, and maybe a that do, well, one problem is, I would say, it creates an immediate hierarchy. The other person, and these hierarchies, the challenge is, this seems like an empirical fact, and you're not just telling numbers. What is the problem? But deciding which facts we mention, which questions we ask, so we get certain answers, that can't be decided. Simply empirically. Let me give you an example. Let's do it with numbers. So, I grew up in Austria. There's a Jewish community there. Approximately lost 64,000 Jews were murdered by the Nazis in Austria. And somewhere around 10,000 Romans. Similar numbers again. I can also tell you percentages, however. 30% of Austria's Jews were murdered, and 80 to 85% of the Roman population. Neither is corrector or incorrector way of saying it. Something else you might feel as I'm doing this numbers game is it doesn't feel right to start playing with numbers. So if I imagine my grandparents and telling them this sort of numbers thing, I think they would have stared at me and not understood what I do. Because it actually humanizes the victim. So we can see that there are challenges with comparisons. How do we avoid what we do then? Well, my suggestion is we write relational histories. Nikki also mentioned the histories of entanglement. So, not compare genocides, but ask first, before we do any such exercise, ask really how do humans interact with each other? What did Roma do think when they interacted with each other? Or interactions were sometimes difficult, and sometimes limited. How did they ignore each other? In what way? Are they in the same space and not acknowledge each other? So, let me take you back. Let me take you back in time to where, for my purposes, the story begins. Of course, Jews and Roma lived in Europe before any of this happened. But this way of thinking their suffering together, that they suffered like us, phrase it, really comes up only with Nazism and not before. So if we go to the Nazi era and we look at the period 1933 to 1939, so this is a period before World War II starts. It is also a period when it's not yet a genocidal regime. It is isolating Jews, expropriating Jews, abusing Jews, killing individual Jews, and Roma, but it is not yet a genocidal regime. So in this period, as pressure builds up, you would not know from Romani or Jewish sources that they know about what is happening to each other or that they compare each other's fate in any productive way. If anything, Jewish sources are really most of what we have. What we can see is an emphasis on difference. So you would not know from Jewish newspapers in Germany, outside of Germany, that Roma and Sinti were actually in special types of camps before Jews. For Jews, it really starts 38 with Kristallnacht. They ended up in camps starting 35 in Cologne, and then 1936 in places like Berlin, Frankfurt am Main, Düsseldorf, various other cities have these municipal camps, special types of camps, at the outskirts of cities usually, where they are policed and isolated. Why did Jews not really mention these camps? Likely not because they're Jews, but because they saw them like everybody else did, like their neighbors did, when it comes to measures against populations where there is a long-standing policy of marginalizing them. They probably understood arresting these people who are seen as difficult in the city, saw that as business as usual. Very much in contrast to, say, a boycott of Jewish stores, April 1st, 1933, which they would see as a departure, a fundamental departure from how things had been. There was also very rightly very little reason for German Jews to think they would ever end up in these camps. They would end up in camps together, but not these types of camps. The result of all of this is actually quite important, because historians very often turn to the voices of victims to understand what is happening, and then turning to Jewish voices, you would not hear these stories. In fact, the very early historians are very often Jews. Then there is a tendency to, after writing perpetrator-focused history, to listen more to these Jewish voices. And from all of this, what you end up with is a narrative that doesn't have the Romani story in it, very naturally doesn't have it in it. So from what we can see is a direct connection, basically, from perceptions at the time, where Jewish victims don't see the parallels, to the post-war attempts to write the histories of that suffering, which don't include Roma in the general chronology. Right? If you studied Holocaust in any setting, 35, 36, 35 are the Nuremberg laws, but these camps are not showing up in the chronologies. All of this, I should say, changes with the genocidal policies that radicalize after 39 and then 41 in particular. At this point, Jews, before this, they are really symbols for each other mostly. After this, they really become embodied people and witness each other's suffering. The most famous place for this is Auschwitz-Birkenau, where you have a ramp, famous ramp built in the spring of 44 for the murder of Hungary's Jews. And Roma and Sinti partially built that ramp, in fact, much like Jews will build the camp that they are in, if I should say. And then they are some of the last witnesses, basically the last non-perpetrators to see these Jews alive are very often Roma and Sinti. There are many testimonies from both sides that are similar. Some of them are indeed visual, others are actually auditory. This is the case very often for Jewish testimonies. There was a ghetto in Lodz, second largest one in Poland. There were 5,000 Roma deported to a separate part of the Jewish ghetto. And the testimonies mostly are about hearing screams from the other side. Similar testimonies are from August 2nd, 1944. That night, the whole Romani camp, so-called gypsy camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau was liquidated in one night, 4,000 people murdered. And for many Jews who describe this as one of the worst nights of Auschwitz, what they remember are the screams and nothing else, because they couldn't see anything. Many of these experiences left indelible marks, and I should add here to the indelible experiences the tactile as well. I won't dwell on these. Includes taking the other person's, being forced to deal with the other person's property, as well as dealing with the corpses of the other group, for which we have examples in both cases. All of this, nevertheless, leaves us a bit with a paradox that I should mention. I said indelible marks, but that's not the same as knowledge. Knowing how the other person died, feeling deep solidarity with the other person, for seeing what happens to them, is not the same as knowing who they are. Knowing their name, knowing which language they spoke, knowing anything beyond the fact that they died. The paradox is that the people who did sometimes interact more with each other often had more complicated relations to each other. Some were positive. There are cases of rescue of each other, Roma rescuing Jews, smuggling networks where they're connected, and others, though, where the Nazis make one group basically oversee the other. The most famous case appears here in Elie Wiesel's memoir, Northern Transylvanian Jews who were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau and for 2 weeks approximately in a camp with German Sinti, German Roma, who were their capos. And there are these memories of being abused. Basically, the entrance into this concentration camp universe was through the experience of having them as capos. That doesn't mean it is necessarily typical. More often, Jews are in charge of Roma, simply because most of these places were built to persecute them. They were just there. But these are experiences that certainly left a mark in memory. Both, and I have here the Yiddish version of that as well, so it's an earlier version actually of the book, which is slightly different, and it has that same scene already. What can we learn from all of this? Well, first of all, you can see why for this type of politics, for these kind of relations, this comparison with Berlin at the center doesn't make sense. The way people had talked about Roma and Sinti and Jews, basically theorizing who was higher in the hierarchy, what were the racial policies, that's not what mattered here. It was very pragmatic, it was very often local, and not a Berlin-centered story, the things that really determined their interactions. Second, there's this inverse relationship between knowledge and solidarity. More knowledge doesn't mean more solidarity, and the other way around. And then finally, what you can see here is that Jews and Roma really suffered next to each other, but not with each other, to a large degree. The story will nevertheless be closely tied together, which is what I'll get to now, but it is tied together not or to a limited degree, through the injustices suffered during the Nazi era. What ties them together is the attempt to reckon with that injustice after the war. And this is what I want to turn to now. This is where things really start to change. And to illustrate that change, I want to show you a fascinating document that I found. So this is a document from the Jewish Community Archive of Vienna. It's part of a whole series of lists. There were tons of lists here, including Jews who got food from American Jewish organizations, the Joint, Jews who were in a concentration camp for 3.5 years. My grandmother is on one of those lists. Right next to that list is this one. All the other lists, as you might expect from the Jewish community, are about Jews being persecuted. This one is not. It's called A List of Gypsies Registered with Us. And it's a list of 33 names of people who signed with what was an institution created by the Jewish community called the Action Committee. I can tell you about 2 of these people. They're the 2 people who bring these 33 together. These are actually 2 large families. Their name are Adolf Gusak and Hermine Horvath. So it gives you a bit of a sense of these survivors. So these are 2 people, a man and a woman, who found each other after the war, had both lost everything pretty much. So Gusak had lost his first wife and son, Horvath, her parents and 4 siblings in the camps. They both had nothing when they came back. Gusak had been an orphan even before the war, who had nothing. Horvath's family had a small house, did not receive it back. There was a historian's commission which shows that it's completely the norm. In late June 1946, they go to Vienna from the countryside and sign up with this institution of the Jewish community. They do it in a situation where there was also a general concentration camp survivors association, which tended to also be very skeptical of Roma and Sinti. Basically people who said, this is an honor to be in this category. People who are deemed work shy, asocial, or in any way might seem criminal cannot be part of it. And as far as they were concerned, Roma were automatically suspicious of being in that category. Jewish community was different and usually did confirm their that they belonged into this category of victims. The 2 groups did have several things in common, I should say, at the moment of liberation. All survivors, the first thing they would do is try to figure out if family survived, go back, retrace what was left. Roma and Sinti did this. Jews did this. For both, coming home meant that they faced their neighbors, who were not happy to see them usually. There was anti-Semitism still after the war, and there was still anti-Roma sentiment. So both had these overlapping experiences, but they also had fundamentally different experiences. Jews had built up an infrastructure much longer ago already to help them in a communal way beyond borders. And the most important institution here is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint, which really fed much of Europe's Jews at this point, did so in Vienna as well. I have a wonderful case also of a German Sinti woman who said her family really got fake IDs as Jews so that they could be in a Jewish DP camp and listen to Yiddish theater as well, apart from enjoying getting joint distributions. So here, what they get here is a very beginning of some form of recognition, perhaps, the attempt of recognition. But really what recognition needed, and this is the second step that was still missing, is a historical narrative. Basically, you're on a list, but of what is your story? Who can acknowledge your story? And to get to how difficult that was, really, I want to tell you about a book. And this is a strange book. I can't show you an image. I would love to have an image of it, but it's a book that was never written. So it was never written. I have no image, but I do have an author. And the author's name is Gerald Reitlinger. Gerald Reitlinger was really a groundbreaking person. He published he's an art historian, a British banking family. He published The Final Solution in 1953, the first real book to be a survey of the Holocaust as we understand it now. Sort of book that all the prosecutors in Germany were giving each other. He had as resources the Nuremberg trial records. He also had an institution that would help him. That's the Wiener Library in London, one of the first Holocaust institutions, really, already founded actually in 1933 in Amsterdam. We know they supported him massively because there are packets and packets of letters where they say he's borrowing book and he's not returning his books. So we have all these complaints. So we know he got them. He also had a wonderful publisher, the name of George Weidenfeld, Austrian emigre. Weidenfeld had a wonderful time in the late 50s. He made some great decisions. He published Nabokov's Lolita, which was prohibited in the US and thus sold like nothing else ever did, because that's what happens with prohibited books. He had the money. Reitlinger was thinking, after several books, of publishing something new. He said, hey, why don't you write a sequel about the Romani genocide? You're the expert already. We have the resources. Why don't you go and do this? So what he does is he writes to another person with whom Weidenfels worked, the secretary of the International Auschwitz Committee, and asks him for material. And this person, Hermann Langbein, tells him, responding to your letter, I have to repeat that currently material about the fate of the gypsies in Auschwitz is not available in our collection. We know from the response, what then Langbein writes to Weidenfeld, that meant that Reitlinger simply said, well, then I'm not writing a book. There's a bit of a secret here about historians and how they work with archives and have other people do the work for them, usually civil servants arranging the material before they enter the field ever. What Langbein realized here, and why he was upset, is not just that this was a lazy guy. It's rather that he understood what was at stake. He had been working with Sinti and Roma in Austria in particular, trying to get them restitution. He knew what it would have meant for these people if they went into an official office and could say, there's a story here. This famous author wrote about us. This is not just something I'm making up. And it's that thing that was missing. For that to change, it really took institutions to collect material. And one of the first institutions to actually do that is the Wiener Library again, which was also at the vanguard of collecting testimonies, I should say, starting in 1938 with Kristallnacht already. They had a whole project of collecting testimonies very early on when most institutions did not care actually about testimonies, including survivor organizations. Starting in 1957, they had their Viennese collaborator actually actively asked for that person to collect testimonies of Roma and Sinti. And the testimony, I told you earlier that there were these two names on a list. How do I know their story at all? Well, it's thanks to Ivar Reichmann and this effort. These people on the list ended up giving testimony to the Wiener Library. And I mentioned here something else. I mentioned that they paid, well, 150 US, I think by now it's probably 200 Canadian, that they paid per testimony. And, you know, sometimes it seems like it's in bad taste. Why would Who cares about how much they paid? But it actually matters a whole lot. Because there's good intentions, like Reitlinger, and then there is execution. And what it takes for me to tell you this story was resources. All sorts of resources. Some of them are easily visible, like the actual price paid here to that person who collected the testimony. It took an archive. There were 3 indexers working on all these testimonies, paid in a very complicated way through the claims conference that could only pay Yad Vashem, and Yad Vashem paying overpriced value for the copies that they got so that this could be paid. There was a whole construction you needed to make this happen. It had to survive also. These institutions were all nearly bankrupt. It's a miracle that they survived, thanks to support from other survivors usually. Only with all of this would these testimonies actually reach us. What these efforts usually had in common that started is they were driven by Jewish victims of Nazism. It was not the new generation of leftists that very often thought and idealized various, didn't actually think a whole lot of Roma and Sinti, I should say, but thought of itself as alternative and rethinking these things. No, it was the survivors themselves that usually started these efforts. Second, the survivors themselves had all sorts of identities. Some of them would have rather called themselves communist, etc. But what their networks were very clearly Jewish networks. It was one Jewish survivor communicating with another Jewish survivor to make these things happen. And ultimately, the Wiener Library would also be the first one to support the writing of a book by one communist Jewish author and another author. The first book to really be that history of the Romani genocide, called The Destiny of Europe's Gypsies, published in 1972. So in all these respects, Jewish institutions started to be essential for writing this history. With none of this did the asymmetries go away. And this is where I'll also fast forward, much closer to the present, because there's an asymmetry still in the relationship, right? Who is commemorating what? But I would say that as we go further in time, things do fundamentally change. They change certainly by the present, when you have a new generation as well of people who are in a much more similar situation. So you still have strong Jewish institutions that are doing a lot of the work, but you also have a whole host of young Romani intellectuals who are very often going to the same universities, doing the same short-term projects, which is how most of them are financed, whether they're Jewish or Romani, doing the same unpaid internships to start their career. So they meet on a much more equal footing, I would say. And they have opportunities to show solidarity. And I'll just give you 2 examples here very quickly. The first one on your left here is the biggest Romani youth organization, Ternipe, which a year after there was a terror attack against a synagogue in the East German city of Halle, sort of sent a solidarity message here. So this is on social media. The advantage of social media is you can really see reciprocity in amazing ways. So here they are, in this case on Facebook, they are writing, that they want to commemorate what happened to their Jewish brothers and sisters here. A few months later, the Jewish students of Germany are, for the holiday of Hanukkah, they are lighting candles, and for each candle, each of the 8 candles, it's a human rights issue, and one of them is then dedicated to their Roma and Sinti, and this is the gender-neutral way of writing it in German. So they are reciprocating by commemorating what is happening to Roma and Sinti. If you think so what doesn't change is that there is still the asymmetry, but there are places to discuss it, which is what is happening among Roma and Sinti and Jewish activists. And if you think of where we started this story, where I started in 1933 of people not seeing what happens to each other, see the beginnings of small forms of interviewing each other in an asymmetrical way, and you get all the way to this. you can see why it's paradoxical again, as this might sound. I think there's a hopeful element to the story that I am telling. My own book is actually also a product of this dialogue, I would say. I would have not been able to do my work empirically, nor with the ideas, had it not been for the conversations I've had with my Romani colleagues. Rewriting history is not something we do in archives. It is something we do in dialogue. So what is the message that I have and that I think my book has? It's that this is a unique story of proximate suffering. I hope it allows us to rethink what types of responsibilities we have towards each other, but also what it means to have unequal alliances, when really I don't think there are any other alliances to be had. Thank you. Yes.
So I've been told that I'm the MC, which I think is hilarious because, as we can all see, we have a pro. But I just want to invite everyone. This is a lot, perhaps, for many of us, new information, and I think that Q&A is continuing this dialogue that Ari just discussed. So I know everyone says it, and it's not necessarily true, but there aren't dumb questions. I would invite people to ask questions. We have someone who's dedicated the last 10 years to figuring out how to try and answer some questions. So I would invite a broad version of questions, maybe specifically to the arguments made, but also if you want to learn more information. And I want to say before we do that, I've been shimphing at myself that I didn't say Schimpf instead of Schmidt. I am so devastated. But we're going to move back to the lecture now. Ari, does anyone have any questions? Oh, come on, guys. We're too smart to not have questions. Yes, will you please introduce yourself? Yes.
Hi, my name's Terry Tomsky. I'm professor in the English department here. Actually, I'm interested in hearing more about your experience in the archives. Maybe you could just speak to that a little bit. And
yes.
And I was also wondering if you had any contact with the children of the survivors and the third generation as well. But I'm mostly interested in your encounter with the archives. Thanks.
Yes. So, two encounter questions, basically. So the archives are very interesting. And one thing that motivated my project is really, if you go to any of the Holocaust archives, you will find things that deal with Roma in some way, that are indexed to deal with Roma. But it's something they might not be aware of. Actually, when I started my research, I went to Yad Vashem, which sometimes can be difficult, so I already knew. I asked a colleague to ask her good friend who works there to have an insight, So I meet this old man in front of the library, smoking. It feels like a incognito, like, can you give me the good stuff in the archive? And, it's the story I got. It's like, he said, sorry, man, you came for nothing. I don't have anything. And all you have to do is go to the catalog and type in this case, Tzu'anim, which is gypsies in Hebrew, and there are hundreds and hundreds of entries. But because of the way these archives are structured, they tend to be Jews speaking about Roma. Not exclusively, but mostly. So my challenge was, what do I do with that? You can just throw it out and say, that's not the authentic voice, I'll leave. But that's not what I wanted to do. I want to work with what is actually there. So part of my story really comes out of this encounter with the archive and what to do with it. And it's in a deeply asymmetrical archive, and of course my field is not unique in this in any way. I think what is unique is, so it's very common, people working with the colonial archive is one of those keywords, like there are many groups in the world where you only really can fully reconstruct what is happening then through the people who were trying to rule over them. This is different, actually. And we have that with the Nazis, right? We have the Nazi archives both for Jews and Roma. So that's neither Jews nor Roma decided to be in that archive. They were forced to be in it. But here you have one minority owning the archive of another minority. And that's so unique, I find. And it's fascinating. And it's not, I just want to be very clear, right? Jews had an incredibly hard time building up these archives. These are incredible efforts. I mean, it sounds like a, you know, I just want to be clear that the reason these stories are not seen is also because they had to struggle to build these archives so immensely. So it's just an honest challenge, I believe, that one is facing. And yes, I've been in touch, I mean, a lot of the people, and when I try to give back, it's very often also dealing with the next generation. As is the case with, right, it's a longer answer I want to give about what it means to be second and third generation, because one thing is to have experienced, when parents, grandparents have experienced something, and the other is the identification that a lot of people have with that story as a national story. So this Ternipe group that is here to the left, most of the youth, so it's a big youth organization, but their key event is that they're going to Auschwitz-Birkenau around August 2nd of every year. And it's the initiation really into that memory. But it's the initiation, so the most of the Sinti and Roma murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau were from Germany, the Protectorate, so Czech Republic today. And yeah, few Polish Roma, but not many from Yellowstone. But most of the Romani activists these days come from Romania, Bulgaria, Spain. They have their own histories, actually, of persecution. But it's in a different place that they remember, which I think is actually somewhat true for Jews as well. I remember my trip going to Auschwitz-Birkenau with my youth organization, Jewish youth organization, but most Viennese Jews, my grandmother was Riga, Stutthof, Mali Trostinets was a massive murder place. It's different memory places that are often forgotten. And so there's your own memory, and then there's communal memory, which I think is something very complicated in a larger conversation. It was a longer answer than you expected, probably, but thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a wonderful history. I just wondered, my own impression, or to my knowledge, is that the common knowledge about the Roma in Canada, the US, and probably in many other countries is that they only know them as gypsies, and they have a fixed opinion about that and a fixed image about that. But I wondered, is there anywhere that you know in the world where what you've been saying about the Roma is better known?
Oh, can you introduce yourself? Can you say who you are?
Eric Schloss.
Yep. I would say, so there is a difference, I think, between the US and Europe, and especially East Central Europe, where you have larger Romani populations. Whether that difference is better knowledge is a different question. There's certainly a more intense, right? In the US, many of my students don't believe, when I first ask them, they're quite surprised that they even exist. It's not that they don't know details about them. It's they appear in country songs as gypsies, but it's surprising that they're not Disney figures, basically. In Eastern Europe, you have or Central Europe also, you have a very different interaction. Though I think it is a profound. There is a knowledge that you are that they were murdered, and I think there is a. I think in the U.S. there are and perhaps in Canada as well, they're an unknown unknown. People don't know what they don't know. In Austria, so I grew up in the 80s and 90s. 93 there was a terror attack against Roma and Sinti in Austria, against Roma in Austria. It really changed the whole dynamic of the debate. It was a bomb attack, killed 4 young people. And after that, the Jewish community was also quite active with these things. So when I was already very aware of Roma and Sinti. There was a deep solidarity there. Actually, for these restitution negotiations, these were class action lawsuits in the US that had to be then negotiated with settlements. The Jewish community basically negotiated for the Romani community, actually.
So I knew these things are happening, but what it meant, you still didn't know anybody. You still knew nothing about the language they spoke. So I think there's still a profound absence of knowledge, I would say. And as far as history is concerned, and this is a problem for my discipline, I think also Roma and Sinti have challenges knowing their history. I think there's a traditional way of transmitting history, but also this, which has been disrupted also through the Holocaust for many Roma and Sinti. The Holocaust just severed the ties to parents, grandparents, and storytellers. So there's a profound way in which they don't know their story, and historians have failed, basically, in the attempt to be part of that process of telling the stories. So I think it's not much better anywhere else, is the short version of it.
Make Claire work for it.
Yes, hello, I'm Robert Smith. I'm a professor in history. I understand that the Nazis view the Roma as socially inferior, racially inferior, they're outsiders, but why do they make the step to systematically murder Roma and Sinti?
Mm-hmm. So the genesis is different from, I think, Jews. So one way I've tried to think about this is to think of two genocides. So I think this is where the comparisons have been challenging. So the few books that exist that try to deal with this, very often a comparative mode, sometimes very explicitly. And they use Jews as outright benchmarks to explain genocide. We can very easily understand the Jewish story, especially the way it was actually originally told at Nuremberg. So the Nuremberg trials were a trial, and as for a trial you need intent. It was not, later we have this debates about genocide and intent, but generally for murder, for these trials, what prosecutors are professionally doing is show intent to action. And this they did fairly well. We don't believe the story this way anymore, that there's a blueprint originally and then they just execute it. We believe that, most historians today believe that there's a complicated process. There's anti-Semitism, there's a general broad sort of thrust, but then it's a fairly decentralized process that will lead people ultimately to genocide. But prosecutors like this narrative, and I think survivors like this narrative as well. It explained their own experiences. It's not like survivors knew how the Nazi bureaucracy worked. They knew what they were experiencing, which is hatred and murder. So it made sense for a lot of people. I think there had been an attempt basically to reconstruct the Romani genocide with the same pattern. Basically, Streicher from Der Stürmer was also on trial with, in Nuremberg. So you basically try to reproduce this, like, show me the caricatures, show me what they're saying, next you need the law, then you need the extermination. I think you have a slightly different process here. I would say the persecution of Jews tend to be what I call a loud persecution. Has to do with the centrality of Jews, I think, already for Christianity, that Jews are incredibly known, even, again, to people who don't know them. As long as they hear the Easter sermon, they know who killed Jesus. And you can go out and have a pogrom, mass violence. It's something that is written about. Famously, there was a French Revolution. They discussed what should happen to Jews. Tiny, tiny, tiny minority in France at the time of the French Revolution, but the National Assembly met 22 times to discuss what was going to happen to Jews. It creates a whole lot of paperwork. It's a loud type of persecution in parliamentary bodies with pamphlets that go back and forth, and the emphasis, also the estimates for number of pamphlets produced in the 19th century are insane. Roma and Sinti are persecuted in a different way, largely. Some debates, but it's a consensus persecution. And it happens largely through the executive branch, not the legislative branch. It's not laws, actually, to a large degree. It is lower level executive branch decisions. It's forms of over-policing that are seen as normal. And it creates a different type of paper trail, it's both, the results can actually be incredibly similar. But the paper trail is fundamentally different. So I would say what happens in the Nazi era are two forms of radicalization, right? This happens with a revolutionary right-wing regime that believes it has utopian aims of a racial society, and at the same time a war that lowers and lowers the barriers to ever more violent attempts to come to that place. So for Jews, it's a familiar story there of basically anti-Semitism and these various solutions to force them to emigrate and eventually ghettoization and then mass murder. For Roma and Sinti, I would say you get a version that might be as typical for genocide, actually, but different. Not really, there's no central propaganda that focuses on them, I would say. It's a bottom-up experience very often, basically neighbors trying to get rid of neighbors. It's a process where, again, this utopian regime here is having a social utopia too. These types of people will not be here. They end up in the same places because, again, these places are places of convenience, right? Even the methods of killing are methods of convenience. The gassing starts with the so-called euthanasia killing of disabled people. They will be tested for the first time in Auschwitz-Birkenau on prisoners of war, or mass murdered Soviet prisoners of war. It's not like any of these methods are dedicated, are attached to one particular group. So I would say Auschwitz-Birkenau, these places are also just convenient places for the Nazis. It's not a theory. It's an administrative decision that then very rapidly radicalizes, I would say, because that's how it's set up to do. Basically, the regime is set up in its structure to ever more radicalize, generally working not with the image of the Führer who gives the orders, but bottom-up initiative all the time, and just deciding top-down whose initiative will now give precedence for now. So I would say that similar process is happening with Roma and Sinti for a persecution that historically has happened with slightly different, not just paper trail, but slightly different thrust.
The next question? Yeah.
Well, actually, it ties in with the most recent question. Was there ever a meeting where everybody sat around and said, well, we all hate Jews, so let's get rid of the Jews, but hey, I want to kill Sinti, so let's set that up. And I want to kill Rastas. We haven't invented Rastas yet. And so it was a broad thing to kill Jews, but was it a case of individual people or small subgroups had an animus towards another specific group and wanted to use this process, both the bureaucratic and the physical process, to get rid of the people they didn't like?
So is there a meeting?
Well, I'm still Jeff Davis. I thought I said that. Maybe it's because I heard.
Okay. So I mean, is there centralized in a meeting? Is that?
Well, it's like the process of deciding.
It's a process of deciding.
Did they?
Yeah. I mean, it's too top-down in a way. I think even meeting, I teach the Wannsee protocols and the Wannsee meeting in my class sometimes, which is this fascinating, right? It's January 20th, 1942. And at most Holocaust museums, it will be a central place where it's the meeting, basically. And the Holocaust museums will have it when it was first discovered in 47 and got brought to the prosecutor in Nuremberg at the time, Kempner. It was sort of the smoking gun document, and because it has all the higher ups, the document, the minutes are very strange because Eichmann will say that he manipulated them to not actually include explicit language. But also, it comes after mass murder has started. Basically, all historians understand that the decision came before this. The Einsatzgruppen already killed hundreds of thousands of people before this meeting. Chelmno has started to be operational. What we understand of what the meeting actually to be is that this is a massive central project of the regime, and the SS is taking control of the process, invites all these other ministries, Interior, Ministry for the Polish East, etc., to confirm that. So that is all that is happening here. The decision-making that you're speaking of, we don't have in this form for Jews either. We can see that it happened. There is a discussion that we know it's happened in the second half of 1941, but then historians that I don't care about these discussions, whether it's in July or in November, but there are two camps. But we know it happens before, but we don't have a meeting in this sense. We do have meetings where people are thinking in those terms. And there is actually a conference that takes place much earlier, 1933, where there's a very similar language used for Roma, which is just striking, but it's not a proper answer, because I think it's just striking to see something that looks, even the protocols look so similar to the Wannsee protocols. 1933 in Austria, not Nazi Germany yet, but it's a guy called Porci. He will run in the Burgenland. He will be the Nazi Gauleiter so the Nazi governor. And he will radicalize anti-Roma policy like nowhere else. And they already discuss basically how to get rid of Roma and Sinti. And it's a longer, complicated story. This whole province came from Hungary to Austria. It had a Romani population that partially moved there, and then world economic crisis happens, and there's various conflicts that are happening there, but it's in this region that governors come together and start discussing how to just rid themselves in whatever way they can of these people. So we have these kind of things. Otherwise, it's a decentralized process, and I should add one more element, perhaps. We say Nazi Germany the whole time. This is true also for Jews, especially for the Romani genocide. Other regimes are quite central. Some of them are really more closer to puppet regimes, but not quite. The Ustaša, the independent state of Croatia, murdered Jews, Orthodox Serbs, and Roma in Jasenovac in very large numbers. That is an independent project to some degree. Right? The Germans have no interest in murdering the Serb population also. This is their project. Romania, next really large area. Deportation to Transnistria. So 25,000 Roma will be deported there, next to Jews. So it's Antonescu. It's an ally. It's not a puppet regime. It's an ally of Nazi Germany with its own program here of mass murder. So in this sense, also we don't have a single meeting because we have multiple actors, in fact, which is why the legal frameworks we have that come through Genocide Convention, et cetera, are all, even for these old cases that are allegedly setting up the whole framework, are actually much more complicated, ultimately, I would say.
Thank you. Herbert Sachs. Thank you. A very informative lecture. Have you done work, or are you planning on doing any work about the extermination of disabled? And was it only disabled of Jews, Roma? Was it also German and Aryan disabled?
Yeah. So yes. So the murder of disabled, which I haven't worked on, other people have, I should say. And there's a wonderful new book by colleague Dagmar Herzog on the history also of that persecution, also into the post-war period. They are not defined by ethnicity per se. So these first killings. So first of all, it starts actually with forced sterilizations. So it's a 1933 law already, and then radicalizes into these murders, which are centralized. So there's a central decision really here. In this case, I would say, this is Operation T4, it's called, after a place in Berlin. Literally, this is very much centrally done through Berlin. Ends in 1941, and then it becomes decentralized again, actually. So it's never, these narratives, like, starts decentralized, becomes centralized. In this case, it's the opposite. So they are different. There are, however, very clearly they will target in a much more radical way So there's a special program, I think it's called 14F13, murder of anybody disabled in concentration camps. We also can see very clearly the motives when they move to other, so right, Nazi Germany is an expanding realm of sovereignty where they will apply their policies. In Poland, we know of cases basically where they need to clear beds for the army, and they will simply murder every single person in a disabled home and clear it out, as they would say, and thus make space for the beds. So there they will be more radical. And so you can see they will have different ways of doing it. It's a hidden process in Germany. It is something of an embarrassment at the same time. And their religious reasons are Catholic Church. There are various groups that are actually disturbed by these things happening. But there's much less resistance when it comes, and a different way of doing this, which is open shootings, when it comes to doing the same things with these other groups whom they believe to be inferior. So in that sense, racialization still plays a role, I would say, if we look at it at a European scale, even if not for the original T4 operation.
So this is kind of related to that, and it's related to the quote. You know, first they came for, then they came for, then they came for me.
Yes.
The Romani were targeted before the Jews, and presumably disabled people first, and then gay people. And I'm wondering if there's any records of stories about gay people in the Jewish records that support their loss or tell their story, and if anyone's tried to do that.
Yeah, so the yeah, and I wouldn't say that because the first, the Bonhoeffer, I mean, that famous quote, which are multiple versions because he probably never said it, was right. None of these were first, in a sense, right? It depends always what you look at. I mentioned these camps where they were first, but of course Jews were also persecuted. I mean, April 1st, 1933 already. So I mean, it depends always what you look at, right? None of them are in that sense first, and of course. Homosexuals have been persecuted throughout, and there's a radicalization. It's hard to say who's first in that sense. As far as sources go, there is, so people have done this. Where they've gone recently is actually in a more complicated way, because you can look at the broader category now of LGBTQ category. You could look at persecution of these people, which is usually male homosexuals. There are actually more cases we've found now of women as well who have been persecuted, but in general, the broader policies are towards men. So this would be a category where a particular paragraph of the original Prussian code is applied to others. But there's also a history of gay sexuality in ghettos and camps that is much more complicated. So you have people persecuted as it, but you also have simply people being either engaging in queer sexuality or identifying as. You have much more complicated things. So there are some scholars who have started to work in that sense also on these things, and their Jewish sources matter. There suddenly that matters, and some of these are also, I mean, I should say, it's also then eventually will tie into histories of sexual violence, which are very, very complicated. And actually I have an undergraduate student who just started. Incredible to read these stories of basically homosexual rape in the camps.
So many questions, let's go.
Michael Fisher, Hungary, 400,000 plus Jewish Hungarians were sent to Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
What happened with the Roma people in Hungary? Is it well documented? Is there good archives? Was it at a national level? Was it at a local level? their persecution?
So I have colleagues in Hungary who have been doing great work on this. It's of course a story that again was much later in the way it has been told. The people who have been active in this tend to be the ones who work in these Jewish institutions rather. So right, you have the official state ones, and then you have the other Holocaust museum that's not the House of Terror. So they have been starting to reconstruct that story more. Where you have overlaps in their stories, it's where they so before we get to the murder, there are these forced labor units, right? The labor units instead of the military. Their Roma and Jews will both be sent. They will not be part of these deportations to Auschwitz-Birkenau. They start in spring '44. There will be a later attempt to some of them already are sent there. There is it's called the Star Fortress at Komaron, where they will be so they have detention facilities that they built for them. But basically, and this is I think true for several places, the time runs out. Before you get to that last stage, right, you have detention, then these detention facilities end up being too full, then they say too full means we have to, permanently rid ourselves of these people, where you get these cascades of events that lead all the way to mass murder. We don't get there for some of these places, and Hungary, I would say, is one of them, which is a question of chronology, I think. And chronology matters a whole lot, I think, also for the Jewish genocide. I mean, there are various reasons why 75% of Dutch Jews will die, but 25% of French Jews. Which has, among other things, to do certainly with direct rule of the Germans in the Netherlands, and indirect rule in some form of parts of France, but also chronology. They start later. So I think that matters for Roma here when it comes to the Hungarian story.
Just another question. I remember reading an article by an American academic who basically pointed out that Hitler received a lot of his opinions from things that were happening in Canada and the US.
Mm-hmm.
For example, eugenics. And one of the worst places for that was Alberta, which had a eugenics board and a home in Red Deer, and was finally dissolved but not till 1972.
Yes.
And this author claimed that a lot of Hitler's ideas against the handicapped were based on what he had read about Alberta. But also his concept even of Liebestrom was based on the American westward expansion concept of manifest destiny.
Yes.
And which he took to heart.
Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely. So there are different ways in which I would say the British Empire and its former colonies were an inspiration. So when it comes to eugenics, it's I think complicated because eugenics is such a broad movement that is actually the reason it works in so many places is because it's not associated with left or right. It's a bit like these other persecutions. It's somewhat more consensus. So they do look, in the US it's Indiana, which starts in 1905, forced sterilizations. So I think there you have an international movement. What the Nazis certainly do, there's some progressives who also believe this, right? The argument for eugenics, I should say, so why is it say progressive, so how does all of this make sense? The argument is really, it's an attempt of penal reform as well. The argument is it's unfair to put these people into prisons if they can't help it. How do we deal with this? If people have an innate sense, if we believe that through the discoveries of social Darwinism and whatever, we think that nature matters a whole lot. What do we do with these people? And then the answer is, well, we should stop them from, the most passionate thing we can do is to stop them from existing. And some progressives believe this too, as part of a penal reform movement as well. So there's a right-wing version, there's a left-wing version. The Nazis here can certainly claim to be part of a larger movement, and we have letters from US organizations, Canadian organizations that congratulate them on being the vanguard. Say, thanks for doing the things we're not man enough to do, basically, here. Like, thanks for being an example. There are other things where they are a model, I would say. Manifest Destiny is important for them. The British Empire is a model for them. And then there's another newer book by Yale historian, legal historian James Whitman, on citizenship questions. And it's not, so what people have been often thinking of is Jim Crow, so racial laws in the US, being a model. And that's somewhat true, but there are particular parts that really fascinated them. What really fascinated the Germans in 1935, and in particular the lawyers. This is not true. We always have to distinguish between different phases of the war, I think, also. This is only true for the earlier period, I believe. They also believe the US is on the wrong way of, racial mixing, etc. They also believe all sorts of things at the same time. But the lawyers are very interested in the idea that there's a tiered form of citizenship. The real citizens, and then you have other tiers downwards. And this is Jim Crow, but it's also all these territories that the US has, the so-called island cases. It's Chinese exception rules, it's Marshall Islands, it's Puerto Rico, it's the Philippines, and these Supreme Court cases, and it's liberal Supreme Courts that seem to be ruling on second-class citizenship, and they're fascinated by how you can do this. And the reason they think Canada and the US are actually interesting is that they are powerful, emerging industrial states. They have enough examples from colonial areas where this is happening. So it's not like there are no other examples. But they don't want to be, they don't see themselves as a colony after all. They want to know what it means to apply that in the homeland, basically. And this is where these former British colonies, the sort of settler colonies, where you have a combination of an image of equality and deep inequality at the same time. A racialized inequality, but the yeoman farmer, they're all equal, there's no nobility, at least in the US. That is attractive to them. That equality, they want both the equality and the racialized inequality. So that's why these models work for them, I would say. So in many respects, I think they are indeed looking at different places around the world. This will, by the way, work best, I think, for the earlier period. Once things turn to full genocide, I don't think they're anymore looking for examples here. That is. We don't see that happening. But the other languages they will use, in NISCO, they will create a brief project of having a Jewish reservation. The word reservation isn't by coincidence. Thinking of native Indian reservations. That's their image that they have. The same thing for Roma and Sinti, by the way. There's a Himmler decree at some point, again, not executed in this form, where he says that he wants reservations for true gypsies. Basically, 90% will have to be murdered, but there are these few pure gypsies, and they will have tribal leaders who will identify them, and it's basically they're sort of frozen in time in these sort of museum-like spaces. And these fantasies very much are inspired by what is happening on this continent, I would say.
We have time for one last question. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Parker student from MacEwan. Have you seen progress in the representation of Sinti and Roma, like they're suffering in public history today?
Yeah, I think. Well, it's easy to have progress when you start with zero, I think. So that would be so. The question is what it means and if it's sufficient progress, but there's certainly progress, I would say. The European Union certainly had a role in this, I would say. Whether these programs are all successful is always debatable, but there was a decade of Roma inclusion initiative, long past now. So there were multiple initiatives that started. I think what strikes me is, the story I told is clearly centers around the Holocaust, and an effort that I'm trying to do as a historian. So I think Romani activists are also doing a whole lot of different things, and so there's a lot of things happening. And I think this is also the great thing. I actually cannot summarize it because it's diverse enough, and there's so many things happening that I don't think there's a single way to summarize it. So there's a wonderful institution called ERIAC in Berlin, for example, which tries to be, we could call it a Romani Academy of Sciences also. It sometimes looks, a national movement as well. And they have various initiatives. Many of them are taking place online as well, where a lot of new information gathering and dissemination happens, I should say. So for me as a historian, now speaking more from my own discipline, as somebody who's that defines myself to the discipline, I think the challenge is also to go beyond the Holocaust, actually. Basically, you have this enormous group in Europe, and I don't think the challenges are unique to Roma and Sinti, because the fact that we have limited sources, that they are limited ego sources of a traditional type where people write about themselves, and that it's harder to access. That's true for so many histories. For so many people around the world. So we should take up that challenge and write broader histories. And I feel that is still something that it needs to be done. But there is a project now, actually. I'm very happy to be sort of this advisor, part of an ERC project. These are these very large European grants that tries to actually write, and this goes to several questions here, a history textbooks, actually, also for schools, but generally write histories for Central and Eastern Europe of Jews, Roma and Sinti, and disabled people. Sort of to bring them into curricula, to bring them into institutions, and to create, in various of these countries, a large sort of umbrella project that tries to show how these histories can really be told in productive ways. So the history of their life, not just the history of their death.
I can't think of a better place to stop, because unfortunately we have to stop. But that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Ari. We are celebrating this week Jewish Studies. Tomorrow we have a really special opportunity. Bonnie Reichert, actually the daughter of Saul and Toby, is coming to our Central European Cafe to talk about her book. Spoiler alert, we're giving away free copies. Double spoiler alert, we're going to be really bringing out the food. We have a culinary memoir to celebrate. I really hope you can join us tomorrow at 2:00. And I really hope that you can take some opportunities to look up Ari's work and read. He's an excellent writer, not just an excellent speaker. There's a reason why I think that book has now won 6 book awards. Is it 5, 6? Anyways, Ari, thank you again. It's been such a pleasure.